Welcome to a feast of fear where gratitude turns to grief and family gatherings hide unspeakable horrors. Tonight, you'll hear 3 tales of Thanksgiving gone terribly wrong. These stories are based on real encounters, or so the survivors claim. They thought they were safe, but they'd just stepped into the realm of Mr. Scary Guy. Prepare yourself for a journey beyond the ordinary, into the shadows of your deepest fears. Welcome to the world of Mr. Scary Guy. Thanksgiving was supposed to be simple this year, just me, my wife Julie, and our 3 kids, our first holiday at home without the extended family. We'd had enough of the holiday travel grind and decided it was time to make new traditions. A quiet dinner, a movie, and some leftovers before bed. That's what we planned. The meal went smoothly. Julie's turkey was perfect, the kids laughed at my awful mashed potato jokes, and we were all in bed by 10, full and content. It wasn't until I heard the knock at the door, 3 soft taps, that the night took a strange turn. It was nearly midnight. I shuffled downstairs, thinking it was a neighbor or maybe one of the kids playing a prank. But when I opened the door, the street was empty. The only thing outside was a plate sitting on the porch. It was old, chipped, and mismatched with our dishes. On it was a strange assortment: a slice of turkey, a dollop of mashed potatoes, and a single piece of pumpkin pie. I glanced around, expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, but the street was silent. "Julie, did you?" I called, but she was still upstairs. Against my better judgment, I brought the plate inside. The food was cold but looked fresh. Something about it felt off, but I set it on the counter, figuring it was some harmless joke. That night I dreamed of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, circling the house. Each step came with a deep, wet scraping, as if something sharp was being dragged across the ground. I woke in a cold sweat, staring into the darkness. But when I checked the house, nothing was amiss. The next morning I thought the plate would still be on the counter, but it wasn't. Julie and the kids claimed they hadn't touched it. Confused, I checked the porch, and there it was again. The same plate, the same arrangement of food, sitting in the same spot. This time the food looked fresher, almost steaming. I picked it up and the porcelain felt warm, as though it had just been served. "Who's messing with us?" I muttered, setting the plate back on the counter. Julie raised an eyebrow, but even she seemed uneasy. We checked the doorbell camera, but it had captured nothing but static. That night the footsteps returned, louder, closer. I sat up in bed, gripping the baseball bat I'd brought upstairs just in case. My breathing felt loud in the silence, the kind of silence that presses down on your chest. Then came the sound of the fridge opening. I shot out of bed, heart pounding, and crept downstairs. The fridge door was ajar, its pale light spilling into the dark kitchen. The plate was gone. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but the screen flickered and went dead in my hand. The following morning, I found the plate back on the porch, pristine and untouched. The cycle repeated itself for 3 nights. Strange dreams, missing plates, and the unnerving sound of footsteps. By the 4th night, I'd had enough. "This ends tonight," I told Julie as I prepared to stay up and catch whoever or whatever was doing this. I made coffee, positioned myself in the darkened living room, and waited. At exactly 2 a.m. the footsteps began, but this time they weren't outside. They echoed through the house, slow and deliberate. A soft, scraping sound followed each step, like claws against hardwood. The kitchen light flickered on, casting shadows that moved unnaturally along the walls. Then I saw it. The figure stepped into view, its silhouette illuminated by the glow of the fridge. It was tall and emaciated, its limbs unnaturally long, its head tilted at an odd angle. Its face was obscured by shadow, but its eyes glowed faintly, 2 pinpricks of light that locked onto mine. I froze, the bat trembling in my hands. The figure moved to the counter, picking up the plate with long, spindly fingers. For a moment it stood there as if savoring the act. Then it turned to face me. "Why?" I managed to croak, my voice barely audible over the thundering of my heart. It didn't speak, but its jaw twisted open in an unnatural grin, revealing rows of jagged, blackened teeth. A low, wet growl emanated from its chest as it took a step toward me. I swung the bat with all my strength, connecting with a sickening crunch. The figure crumpled, but instead of staying down, it began to dissolve, its body collapsing into a thick black sludge that smelled of rot and burnt meat. The plate clattered to the floor, unbroken. I stumbled backward, gasping for air. The sludge oozed toward the door, leaving behind a dark trail as it vanished into the night. The next morning, the plate was gone and the porch was clean. Julie and the kids woke up unaware of what had happened. But the house felt heavier, darker, as if something had been left behind. I tried to move on, to forget, but the footsteps never stopped. They began faintly, just outside the window, then grew louder each night. Last week I found another plate on the porch, fresh food, same arrangement, and last night I saw it again. Not in the house, but in the reflection of my living room window, staring at me from the darkness outside. I don't think it wants the food. I think it wants me. Thanksgiving with Aunt Marjorie was supposed to be a quiet evening, a single meal, some polite conversation, and then I'd drive back home. But nothing about that night was ordinary. Her house on Pine Hollow Road was as unsettling as ever, an old Victorian with peeling paint and sagging shutters. As I parked, I noticed how isolated it felt, surrounded by barren trees and shrouded in the dim light of an overcast sky. A cold wind whistled through the branches, carrying with it a faint, almost mournful sound. Marjorie greeted me warmly, her frail frame bundled in a cardigan.
"Come in, dear,"
she said, her voice trembling slightly. The house was colder than usual, and an eerie silence hung in the air, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards. Dinner started pleasantly enough. We ate in the dining room, where the walls were lined with faded family portraits. Marjorie chatted about her garden and some old neighbors who'd moved away. But halfway through the meal, her demeanor shifted.
"Do you hear them?"
she asked suddenly, her fork poised midair. "Hear what?" I replied, trying to keep my voice steady.
"The house. It talks when it's hungry."
She gave me a small, unsettling smile and resumed eating as if nothing had happened. I laughed nervously, chalking it up to her eccentricities, but the creaks and groans of the house seemed louder now, almost deliberate. As we finished dinner, Marjorie excused herself to fetch dessert from the pantry. Minutes passed, and she didn't return. "Aunt Marjorie?" I called, but there was no answer. I got up to check, walking down the dimly lit hallway toward the pantry. The door was slightly ajar, but the room was empty. No Marjorie. Only rows of jars and cans, their contents glinting dully in the faint light. Then I saw it, a shadow moving across the far wall, though there was nothing there to cast it. "Marjorie?" I called again, my voice shaking now. Suddenly, a sound, a low, guttural moan, rose from beneath the floorboards. The whole house seemed to shudder. I stumbled back into the hallway, my heart hammering in my chest. When I returned to the dining room, the table was no longer empty. Sitting where I had been moments before was a figure. It was impossibly tall and gaunt, its face obscured by shadow save for two glowing eyes that bore into me. It raised one skeletal hand and pointed directly at me. I turned and ran. Up the stairs into the guest room, slamming the door behind me. My hands shook as I locked it, then shoved a chair under the knob for good measure. Outside, the creaking intensified, the walls seeming to close in around me. The whispering started a moment later, soft, unintelligible, but unmistakably real. I crouched by the bed, clutching my phone. No signal. The whispers grew louder, closer, until they seemed to come from just outside the door. The doorknob jiggled. Then, silence. I stayed there until dawn, too afraid to move. When the first light seeped through the curtains, I cautiously opened the door. The hallway was empty. Downstairs, I found Marjorie in the kitchen, humming as she prepared breakfast.
Sleep well,
She asked, her eyes twinkling with a knowing look. I left that morning, swearing never to return. Thanksgiving had always been sacred at my grandparents' house. It wasn't just about the food or family. It was a tradition steeped in rituals and memories. The centerpiece of every meal was the cornucopia, a large woven horn of plenty overflowing with artificial fruits and vegetables. My grandmother would always say it had been in the family for generations, brought over by her great-great-grandmother from the old country. She called it a symbol of abundance, though I never knew her to smile while saying so. This year I arrived earlier than usual, eager for a break from work. The house smelled of roasted turkey and fresh pies, and I immediately felt the familiar warmth of home. But something was different. The cornucopia, always bright and welcoming in its centerpiece role, seemed darker. Its fruits, usually so colorful, appeared muted, as if the vibrancy had been sucked from them. The woven horn glistened faintly in the dim light, almost as if it were coated in something wet. "Looks a little worse for wear this year," I joked, gesturing to the centerpiece. Grandma's face darkened.
it's fine. Just leave it be.
She said curtly, turning back to the stove. Her reaction was odd, but I let it go. Dinner began as usual. The table was crowded with relatives and enough food to feed an army. Grandpa stood at the head, raising his glass for the traditional toast.
"To the ones who came before,"
he said solemnly. As the family echoed his words, I caught a faint sound, a low, almost imperceptible whispering. It seemed to come from the cornucopia. I glanced around, expecting someone to react, but no one seemed to notice. The rest of the meal passed uneventfully, though I couldn't shake the unease that settled over me. Every so often I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, tiny shifts in the cornucopia like the fruits were twitching. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I stayed up reading in the living room. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of old wood. Then I heard it again, a whisper. This time it was unmistakable, low and guttural, like multiple voices speaking in unison. I turned toward the dining room. The cornucopia glowed faintly in the dark, a soft, pulsing light that grew brighter with each whisper. My breath hitched as the fruits inside began to rot before my eyes, collapsing into black sludge. From the opening of the horn, something moved. A hand, thin, bony, and pale, emerged, gripping the edge of the table. I froze, unable to look away as more of the figure crawled out. Its face was gaunt, hollowed, with sunken eyes that burned faintly red. The air grew cold, my breath forming clouds as the figure fixed its gaze on me.
"Leave,"
It rasped, its voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair. The noise seemed to startle it, and it recoiled slightly before disappearing back into the horn. The light faded, leaving only the ruined cornucopia. I woke the next morning in my bedroom, unsure of how I had gotten there. When I told my grandparents what I'd seen, they exchanged a knowing look.
That's why we keep it.
Grandma said finally.
It's a contract, an offering to keep them at bay.
I didn't press further. The cornucopia was gone by the time we sat down for breakfast, its ashes smoldering in the fireplace. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear whispers. So next Thanksgiving, when you're packing leftovers or leaving food out for stray pets, be careful. You never know what or who might be watching. This is Mr. Scary Guy saying, good night. Sleep tight, if you dare. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe by clicking the icon above. We've also got a playlist full of scary stories on your left side, and a suggested video you'll love on the right. Choose one and keep the scares going.